Welcome, everybody, boys and girls, those who bounce in between. It is your friend, your favorite Donkey Kong themed communist YouTuber, Comrade Dinky Kang, and in this new series, I'm going to be addressing a myriad of arguments that Maoists often encounter from revisionists, starting first and foremost with the argument that I've seen making the rounds on YouTube and elsewhere that Maoists have a purity fetish. So one of the most common claims that Maoists will encounter from revisionists is the claim that Maoists don't support actually existing socialism out of some dogmatic desire for purity in the communist movement, absent of all pragmatism and consideration of material circumstances present in countries like China, the DPRK, Cuba, Vietnam, and Laos. The accusation implies that Maoists abandon an analysis of real-world circumstances and engage in idealism with the assumption that socialism must resemble a preconceived purified notion that doesn't take material reality into consideration in our assessments of the revisionist countries. This is what the revisionists mean when they accuse Maoism of having a purity fetish. They also say that Maoists have a poverty fetish and a violence fetish. Now, I'm not sure why the revisionists default to fetishes, but if Caleb Maupin is to be considered a poster child of modern American revisionism, maybe the revisionist preoccupation with fetishism makes a lot more sense. But anyway, the myth that Maoists have a purity fetish is as good a place to start as any. So let's start to debunk this by talking about dogmatism and sectarianism. If you haven't already seen it, I highly recommend watching the 18th episode of my series, Essentials of Maoism, because I discuss those specific topics and will be building off of what I discussed there. In fact, I recommend everyone go watch the entire series of Essentials of Maoism before this series so that we can all be on the same page. So why do Maoists care so much about revisionism, to the point where Maoists call everything and everyone a revisionist? At least, that's what the stereotype suggests. Well, first of all, Maoists don't call everything revisionist. This implies that Maoists believe only revisionism exists within the world communist movement. Contrary to this view, since the emergence of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism on the world stage, Maoist revolutionary movements in Peru, Nepal, Turkey, Afghanistan, the Philippines, and India, as well as many more that I haven't mentioned, have all actively been fighting for socialism in the modern day, and each of these movements warrants their own analysis. Unfortunately, there's very scarce information about these movements in the West, which probably explains why most people's experiences with Maoists are mostly derived from internet edgelords and strawman impressions expressed by Marxist-Leninists. So I say this as someone who used to be one of those Marxist-Leninists, who considered Maoists to be a bunch of radical dogmatists. In my investigation into Maoism, I began with a certain objectivity, not to convert to Maoism, if you can call it that, but merely to understand Maoism from the Maoist perspective. In doing so, I realized the severity of modern revisionism and how widespread this revisionism is. It's gotten so bad that those who consciously or unconsciously embrace revisionism are cheering for capitalist restoration disguised as pragmatism and imperialism disguised as solidarity. Purity in the communist movement has never been a goal for Marxists. Purity as a concept is metaphysical in nature, and adhering to the view of pure theory, which is absolute and unchanging, is against the very essence of scientific socialism. Dogmatism, which is an undialectical and metaphysical distortion of theory, is unwelcome in revolutionary science and must be resisted. Maoists understand this, and it's in the rejection of dogmatism and numerous other fundamental errors which enables Maoism to emerge as a third and higher stage of Marxism. This fact may hurt the feelings of Marxist-Leninists, but Maoism is simply a more sophisticated and updated version of Marxist theory. This isn't to say that Maoists don't occasionally succumb to the same errors of dogmatism, sectarianism, and purity politics. There is a tendency, of course, to be overzealous in denouncing revisionism. I'll definitely grant that. But that same level-headedness and courtesy is often not afforded to Maoists from Marxist-Leninists, especially from the revisionist MLs who defend modern China. The tendency to be overzealous makes perfect sense when revisionism is enshrined and becomes a dominant part of the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy. Revisionism is one of the single most greatest threats to the world communist movement. It's like a 100-foot tsunami coming straight for us, and the Marxist-Leninists refuse to even turn around and look at it and recognize it for what it is, a severe threat that's already wiped out a great deal of the world communist movement. If you don't believe me, take the USSR for example. Revisionism emerged in the Soviet Union and was allowed to fester, and eventually this resulted in the illegal dissolution of the USSR and a calamity for the world communist movement. If you ask Marxist-Leninists, generally speaking, they'll admit that revisionism at least exists. So I guess that's a good start, but their concepts of revisionism date back to the early 20th century. Edward Bernstein, Karl Kautsky, Nikolai Bukharin, and Leon Trotsky, and the like. The revisionisms of the past are still present, of course, as the arguments these tendencies put forth are still around, but they don't pose the same level of imminent threat that modern revisionism poses. Modern-day revisionism from the orthodoxy of Marxism-Leninism takes on an insidious form of capitalist restoration disguised with the rhetoric of Marxism, just like the revisionisms of the past. But this revisionism specifically is occurring within countries with nominal communist parties in command of state power. For all the talk of defending actually existing socialism from the dogmatists and the purity-fetishists, the Maoists are the ones who actually seem to care the most about actual socialism. There is a difference between a dogmatic desire for purity and a defense of revolutionary communism against modern revisionism, whether the revisionists want to admit it or not. There are a myriad of arguments the revisionists use to denounce Maoism, some of which I've already covered in my previous series, but there are also many more that I'll attempt to address in this series. Seeing as I've already addressed the purity-fetishism argument, we can now move on to another. So stay tuned for the next episode where we talk about the Baizuo argument. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Danky King, out.